Okay, the analysis of the discourse of Omega-3. I'm going to talk about language, I'm going to talk about pack elements, I'm going to talk about color and font, and essentially when we say discourse, we mean a whole framework for talking and thinking about an area. So let me just talk about what we actually did. What ProNova asked us to do a couple of years ago was a piece of work looking at the category. And in fact, we focused in on the US exemplification of the category, excuse me, in order to map the commercial discourse. And by mapping, we just mean objectively, without, in a sense, commenting at that point, just to show what the patterns were in the market at the time, as shown through packs and websites and various other materials. But essentially, a lot of the examples I'm going to show you come from packs, front and back and sides and tops, because it's important that we look at all the pieces of information that are being put out there to help consumers understand and buy into this category. We use analytic processes taken from academic social science. So like Judy, I'm not a scientist in the way that many of you in the room are scientists. But this work is also qualitative. But like all qualitative work, it's systematic. It's interpretative, but it's systematic. It's based in data. But it's interpretative. It's important in the sense that these are human patterns. They're patterns that can be seen by a human when you lay out this kind of material. Why did we do it? Why did they ask us to do this piece of work? Really, if you're trying to understand and work within and perhaps disrupt a category, disrupt in a good way, to work in a way that isn't being done, to present the consumer with something different, it's a really good idea to have a map of where you're starting. So that's essentially what we were doing. So what I'm going to do is to take you through some of the key themes that came from that work and illustrate them as we go. So the first theme is it's really noisy out there. Okay, there's as linguists, discourse analysts, one of the things we look for is like how much language there is, not just what it's saying. And I hope this looks familiar to you, but it's very crowded, very noisy. There's language everywhere. It's quite rare to see large amounts of empty space on packaging. And if you think in your own minds about another category, like those of you who are into it, skincare, for example, face creams, the packaging is very stripped and, bare and spare. I'm sure there will be other categories that you could come up with in your own lives. So, and again, we're not, in a sense, saying this is wrong. It's just an observable fact. It's a quality, a characteristic of this category, that there's lots and lots and lots of language. And that starts to feel a little bit anxious. It's like, what is that's being driven so much that every spare millimeter on the pack is being filled with words, okay? So a bit of crowdedness and anxiety. What we've called linguistic inflation. The language is full of intensifiers, more, better, super critical. Please don't be upset if one of your brands is on any of these slides. We weren't doing this work at all to pick on anyone. What we're doing is actually, as I said, showing the map of the entire category. And it happens that we've just kind of pulled out some of these. We could have filled several slides, I think, with examples of these characteristics. So we've got intensifiers and comparators, more, bigger, better, super critical, ultra. I'm sure you can probably fill in some more. It's kind of a bit like a street market. You're kind of I'm walking through this category, and you're all, with the best of intentions, all these brands are shouting at me from either side. We're better, we're bigger, we're stronger, we're whatever it is. And so it feels as though the category is a bit, say, anxious, it's a bit unsure of itself, it's a bit, like anybody who kind of talks and shouts at you and says the same thing again and again, you start to wonder whether it's trying to convince itself along the way. A third and kind of related a characteristic that we can see across these packs is a kind of machismo. And by that, I mean strength and potency seems to be the name of the game. So strength is all, and Quality, therefore, seems to be mostly about having more and having more intense versions of all of this. So I hope you can see this from these examples and that it feels familiar. I mean, if you just kind of like defocus your eyes and look at these packs, what do you see? You know, you see very dark colours, I think, very intense colours. You see a lot of capital letters. You see a lot of typography, which you might in other forms see perhaps in thriller movie trailers, for example. If I have to speak these packs, I have to use a very dark, booming voice, you know, to do it, because that's all pack design, all communication design of any kind draws on discourse, draws on cues and codes from other categories in order to make its meaning. That's why I'm talking about film trailers, because there's something that's being drawn on from that kind of category, or a particular kind of advertising, or, as I say, a market street stall would use bright colours and loudness in order to draw you in, compared with, say, walking into a very sophisticated upmarket store on Fifth Avenue or Oxford Street, or, you know, the upmarket area of wherever it is you live, where the whole thing would be hushed and quiet and kind of pared down and laid back. So I'm not saying that this is how you have to go, but this is the point we're making, that characteristically it looks like this. So there's a few other issues, though. All this machismo has in some way to be pulled back and hedged. There's a lot of loud claims and assertions in the market, but as Rohit said earlier, not necessarily based on a fact. And one of the things we noticed across the pacts is a lot of use of hedging language, pulling back language. And we know why. You know, the FDA is very strict and stern. The lawyers involved in this will be very careful that the claims aren't being made that can't be substantiated. But for the consumer, this kind of rash of asterisks and hedged claims. So one of these here, I'm not sure if you can see it, says supportive but not conclusive research says that, so-and-so. So do you see what I sense? You know, on the one side, it's being very assertive and confident, and then kind of around the back, there's something that just pulls it back and says, well, we can't quite say that, actually. So this endless race for potency and purity feels like it's undermined potentially by this necessary pulling back. We know why you have to do it, but the contrast between the two is quite profound and significant. So a couple of other things to talk about. One of the things we looked at was a kind of, you might call it a quest for legitimacy. As Judy has commented, oh, thank you. Thanks, that's great. Thank you. Judy's commented that there's science and science. And one of the things you can see very clearly on these packs is a kind of scienciness without necessarily high science. Again, because it's very difficult to put high science on the pack. It's very difficult to put all those, the evidence from all of those studies that have been carried out. But there is a clear yearning, if you like, across this category for scientific legitimacy. Fully understand why. But the scientific credentials, because they're not yet absolutely rooted and normalized and kind of made into a form that can be accessed by everybody, then they have to be suggested and not actually claimed. So we have, I mean, for example, the hexagon kind of device. It suggests quite subtly a kind of molecular level without actually saying it. There is a lot on this slide, for example, of terminology, you know, quite highly technical terms, but woven into language which doesn't quite go there in a scientific way, and so on. So apart from science, how else does the category try to legitimize? And, you know, bear in mind what we're doing, or the reason for talking about this now is about how far can the category actually substantiate a sense of trust. And, you know, so far what we're beginning to see is there are characteristics of the category that don't look like they would support a position of a consumer trust. Either they're neutral or they actually start to make it creak and wobble a little bit because of the kind of flips that are being done and the paradoxes and the difficulties across the category. The second way, there's a whole set of observations about how the category does science without doing science. But we also see other techniques used across the category to establish legitimacy of some kind. And I'll kind of leave you to judge really how solid they are. But again, it's an observed quality of this field that legitimization is an evident desire across the category. Kind of protesting a little bit too much, maybe, to acquire that legitimacy. It looks unconfident. It looks like, at worst, it looks like the category doesn't really believe in itself, which, you know, I know in this room it does. So we have things like stamps and seals, you know, which are a kind of coding for anything that's like stamped, you know, stamp of approval, a seal of approval. When you look very hard, you know, not quite sure who's the authority giving that approval. References, for example, to government recommendations or to doctor, you know, very vague, like doctor recommended 1 per day. Claims of brand longevity, and Judy said earlier that that is something that's quite substantial in how long a brand has been around. But in this context, it becomes a part of the noise around the quest for legitimacy. And endorsements by not sure who, you know, I'm not sure, I mean, how kind of credible or solid or real these things are. It does look like a sort of dance that's being danced by the category. I hope this is making sense to you. Okay, sorry, I'm just going to skip the next slide because I think we had skipped that one. Sorry. Differentiation. So apart from legitimacy, we have two forms of differentiation across brands that we can see in this category. One is by specificity. Okay, body parts, different body parts and conditions. So many brands and products focus on a condition or body part. And the specific benefit is either directly claimed, where it can be substantiated, of course, or it's implied by, you know, the picture of the knee joint or the rubbing of the shoulder in the picture and so on. The problem for the category, though, is that there are, it seems, almost as many brands doing the opposite and creating a kind of panacea position. So is omega-3 really for a particular part of the body, or is it actually for everything? Does it do everything? The difficulty really is that the category doesn't have a single story across this. It doesn't have a single understanding, which it is projecting out through these kinds of communications to help the consumer understand, is it specific omega-3s that are particularly for different parts of the body? At this point, it's all just a kind of morass for the consumer. Interesting also, you get quite interesting lists like this one in the middle here, actual side. So joint health, heart health, brain health, that's good, tick, tick, tick. No fishy aftertaste. Given the same sort of level of significance as really quite profound health-related claims. It's almost as though the kind of designer is kind of going, what do we got? What do we got? Da, 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 da. Oh, and it doesn't taste bad either. There's a sort of, it could be more thoughtful, I think, and could connect rather better, as I'll come on to say towards the end, with what we know about the consumer mindset and where the consumer's coming from, which is essentially, in many cases, a faith in the ability of this substance to do something good over the long term in a really holistic kind of way. So what kind of consumer? The other question we ask of packs is not just, and ads, not just how are they communicating about themselves, but we also ask the question, what kind of consumer are they projecting? What kind of consumer do they seem to expect when they design themselves in a particular way? And what we see on one level is this very kind of rational consumer that clearly, what the expectation of these packs is that people want all this information, they want the rational arguments, they want lots and lots and lots of text on packs and in websites and so on. But is that the same person who is also going to be convinced by a stamp or a seal or an endorsement by somebody? There's something quite sort of odd about the projection of the consumer, which you see, again, across the category. Okay, what I want to talk about now is what you might, well, we call them instabilities or perhaps tensions in the discourse. And by this, we mean problems which seem to be, there seems to be an awareness in the category that these are potentially problematic for the consumer, such that they need to be addressed by communications, whether overtly or covertly. But there are two kind of really quite difficult things going on, and you see packs and ads and websites trying to find a way to negotiate through these difficulties. So we're going to talk about the purity problem and the fish problem, okay? Interesting, surrounded by fish, but that's kind of the point. Let's talk about purity first. Pure, 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 everywhere. It's, I mean, again, we would read this as anxious. It's like if you have to say something so much, at some level, there's an anxiety that people don't already believe it or couldn't believe it, or you have to persuade and convince them. And there is, I talked about linguistic inflation before, there is, I haven't particularly got the, this doesn't particularly show this example of the intensification added to purity. So effectively, the category, the players in the category look like they are in a race, a contest, who can be the purest of the purest of the purest of the pure, because that is something which, across the category people recognize as relevant for consumers, or possibly a worry for consumers, as Judy talked about. But the problem is the purity problem across this market we looked at is quite unresolved, because the category offers two contrasting and non-complementary ways of thinking about what purity actually means. How do you get to be the purest of the purest of the pure? So is this cleaned, detoxed, high science oil, or is it whole oil, nothing taken out, high nature? And there's a deep tension between these. Interestingly, I mean, across the category, between brands, but also sometimes within brands. So a single brand will be constructing an argument, back of pack or wherever it is, that draws on both of these. And I think you can see as we lay it out like this, it's quite a difficult thing for people to grapple with. Is it better that you do something to it and take the stuff out, or is it better that you leave it as nature intended and don't take anything out of it? It's not resolved, and it kind of hangs across the category as an unanswered question. The second problem is the fish problem. And fish are everywhere, okay? And it's unsurprising, because you can't represent omega-3s very easily, can you? I mean, you get the drop of oil, but essentially we're in fish. In case you missed it, the one bottom right there, I thought at first, I thought the designer actually put the wrong thing on the slide, because that's all that's a text box, but look at what's behind it, the shadow of a fish. The fish is never far away. Fish here, fishing nets, it may be so familiar and so naturalized to you that it's hard to see it as a really interesting, all-pervasive, distinctive quality of this category. So what's the problem with fish? Well, the problem with fish is that actually, in its raw state, fish can be quite scary. It's quite primitive. Fish comes before reptiles, in the kind of chain, and reptiles are pretty scary. They can be slimy. People often don't like fish scales. They won't touch fish. You don't have to be terribly phobic to not particularly like the idea of touching a fish. So that's in the raw state. In the cooked, sort of eaten state, fish is briefly pleasurable, isn't it? It's great. Maybe it's great just before you eat it, start to smell it. Lovely when you're eating it. As soon as you've eaten it, what's it feel like? Bones on the plate, you come into the kitchen the next morning and the kitchen smells of fish. There is a lot of people are really put off by fish and fishiness. We were at dinner last night and one of our colleagues really didn't want to peel the langoustine that was sitting on his plate, and somebody else helped him out. Fish has people have a reaction to fish which they don't have to many other kind of categories of food. So how does the category try to manage the fish problem? Again, they sometimes manage it by protesting, by talking about, I mean, pictures of stomachs on packs, and, you know, the fishy burp being, I mean, literally, you know, no fishy burps. I think you saw it on the list I put before. I think the danger really is that it starts to raise the very problem that it's trying to reduce. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a book called Don't Think of a Pink Elephant. I think it's a pink elephant. So if I say don't think of a pink elephant, what do? What's the first thing in your mind? Pink elephant. You know, we don't hear the don't. We just, you know, our brains are quite primitively wired on some contexts, and we just go, fishy burps, ugh. You know, you've just raised the problem that you're trying to resolve. The other way that the fish problem is, that the category tries to deal with this fish problem is to focus on the environment the fish live in rather than the fish themselves. The water, the environment, particularly kind of deep, cold, clear water that's natural and clean. And I think this is an interesting kind of way to deal with it. I think we would just observe that the discourse here is still quite literal. It's quite rational in a way. It's either sort of spoken, you know, the wild ocean fish, or it's a quite naturalistic, realistic depiction of fjords or mountains or whatever it is. And I want to talk in a second about metaphor and abstraction as a way to start to engage differently with this category, rather than the very literal, sort of pictorial kind of depiction of this kind of thing. Okay, so let's talk about how to get beyond it. A few ideas, and these are some of the ideas that we obviously shared with Pronova, just to give you a sense for what you can do with this kind of information. What we suggest really is that if this category is very noisy, loud, looks a bit anxious, all the things I've talked about before, and it's very kind of rooted in a science which is difficult to talk about to consumers without hedging it, and all of the problems I've talked about. And then you put that together with the information and the knowledge and the insight that came from the work that Judy and her team have done. You go, actually, well, could we do better by matching the consumer? For the consumer, omega-3 works best in the imagination. It's a faith-based category. So can we move to a position where we're weaving different kinds of stories? You know, Ereaut talked about weaving stories. We're weaving a different kind of story because we're working in the mode of metaphor and abstraction. So suggesting things and symbolizing them rather than saying them. It's a mode of discourse that I think does not come naturally to many scientists. So it's kind of counterintuitive for this business. But when you start with the consumer, that's where you get to as a real opportunity. It's probably an unused opportunity, a kind of hole, a gap, a way of doing something different. And it's about confidence. I mean, I've talked about anxiety. This is about the confidence not to say things, not to argue. You know, the Surgeon General says, tell them the science and they'll believe. And this, I think we're saying, we're actually kind of disagreeing, or we're saying there is another way, which is they will need science and they'll need science a particular way. But there is a real opportunity to just connect with where people are. So, just to give you a couple of examples, how can you do fish without the fishy? So how can you have the good bits of fishness without the problematic fishy burps or smell or the kind of distaste that many people do have around fish? And here, I mean, we're talking, these are still fish, clearly, but there's a sense in which you might start to play with the aesthetics of fish, you know, their sleekness, their kind of slight mystique and otherworldliness, for example, or their beauty. I mean, you know, the play of light on the scales of a fish is a very beautiful thing. So it's tricky to do because you're close to fish, but it's worth exploring. The idea of depth, again, rather than simply talking about cold, deep water, cold, clear water, there is a different mode of expression in which you can suggest and symbolize and sort of weave a kind of world in which this form of meaning. So I mean, metaphor quite literally is not saying this thing is this. It's kind of saying, look at this, it's kind of like that. Because metaphor has space for the imagination. When you use rational language, when you use direct, what's called metonymic language, you close down meaning. And in science, that's kind of what you want to do. You want to say, this is what this means. Metaphor opens up and allows room for people's own imaginations. It lets the consumer back in to this conversation from where they start. So, Again, cold, deep water, just done in a slightly different way, and maybe depth is a kind of metaphor potentially for that notion Judy was talking about of, you know, working at the cell level. You can start to make some connections. I'm sure this is really hard for many of the scientists in the room, but we are completely serious about this. This is not fluff. This is actually the way that you achieve sophisticated marketing, whilst you also continue to build the science base, the credibility, for other reasons. And finally, just on another example really of metaphor, you know, I think Judy mentioned Nordicness as something which had become, we realised, quite important. The symbolic potential of Nordicness is considerable. Nordicness carries with it meanings of depth and profundity, kind of quiet wisdom, a kind of quiet strength, as well as a kind of mystique. So there's a lot of potential in that idea of Nordic, which could be brought into this category to connect in a meaningful way. So, what's the upshot, really, of all of this? I think what we're suggesting, really, is that there is another way, and if you can connect in a more streamlined way with how consumers are thinking, then you help them, you bring them in. It's a form of simplicity, effectively, to bring them in. But also, it helps you move away from some of the rather unnerving contradictions which are current in the category. So the contradictions between the shouty bit on the front and the, oh, I don't really quite mean it, bit on the back, for example. It just gives you a whole set of alternatives. So the discourse, as I've said, is pretty noisy, it's pretty macho, it's quite messy. There is room to operate on another plane, and a brand, or indeed the category's biggest asset, could indeed be confidence. You have to have the confidence to say very little, which is kind of hard if you think about where you are now with all of that language on the packs and around the business. And what we're advocating is actually to say little, just, you know, suggest a lot. And that is where I'm going to close. I'm going to hand back to Judy for a moment to round this off and to talk about the use that was actually made of these two forms of insight put together. Thank you. Okay, for that, I think I'll just go to the side. Thank you.